Hi, this is a video intended to give you the tools to move from a previous video I've made about making claims, backing them up with evidence, and folding claims together into a paragraph, and expand upon that into the next step, in which you'll take a series of arguments or a series of paragraphs and lay out a full paper or a full story. And we'll talk about a topic also that's really closely tied to that, which is the process of using someone else's story to build new research questions, because the process of laying out your own story can pretty much always lead you to try to find new research questions, and the same goes for identifying the stories in someone else. So we're moving up into a macro level here. We started with a single sentence in the previous video, and then we finished with a couple sentences. Now we're going to move into paragraphs and whole bodies of text. And the real key and first step to story building, and I don't mean story literally here, what I mean to say actually is that anytime you're writing a piece of persuasive writing, particularly in psychology, or a piece of evidence-based claims that you'd like to make, you can think of it as writing a story. It's going to have a beginning, middle, and end. It's going to have a goal to it. It's going to have a point. It's going to have a theme, potentially. And so my advice is to start with that point. It won't necessarily be the end. It'll come at the end, but you'll also probably state it right at the beginning. You've maybe heard of a thesis statement before, and that's what I'm talking about here. What is your point? What's the thing you want any reader of your piece to walk away knowing that was your intention, that this is the thing you were talking about? Again, in writing and psychology, we try to leave things as certain as possible. We try to lose all uncertainty, and what that looks like when you're first starting to read and write in that kind of tone is sometimes repetitive and sometimes over-explaining. You can still over-explain in psychology, but it's a lot harder to do. My advice, especially as you're starting to learn this process, is that you write in a way that feels like you're over-explaining. Be as clear as you can. Say every point in its fullest form. Don't leave things out. Don't use too many pronouns. Don't make it unclear what your topic is of your sentence, of your paragraph, of your paper. State it. So once you've got that point figured out, the first thing you'll need to do is convince your reader that it matters, right? Why should they read about this? Why are you even bothering to make this point? Why do you think this piece of research that you're doing should have been done? Why is it reasonable? Let's say we're going to talk again in this video about an example of a test of the other race effect in face recognition. Why does it matter to learn about the other race effect in face recognition? You want to make that sort of the clear starting point for your story. Then you can kind of back up a little bit and think about, all right, here's we're writing about the other race effect. We're conducting this new study that we believe is going to contribute to the knowledge in the field, and that matters because, first of all, the knowledge in the field would be moved forward, but also because learning more about the other race effect is important for our understanding of some of the unconscious and conscious biases involved in racism. So what do you need people to know about so that they understand the point you're trying to make? Is there terminology you have to clarify? Are there important foundational studies you should describe? What is the current state of that literature? Is a sort of similar, but usually just after type question you'll ask after you figure out what the foundational knowledge is. In our case, it would be something like the other race effect exists, and it is this. It is the fact that people tend to have slightly better memories for faces of their own race, and that is slightly biased toward Caucasian faces, particularly for people who grow up in societies in which Caucasian people are the majority. Has a lot to do with exposure, you'll start to say then, and you'll talk about how exposure and the process of individuation and meeting and knowing lots of people of your own or another race can influence the strength of the other race effect in your own personal face recognition capabilities. And now I'm sort of getting into the current state. You might talk about some of the most recent work in the field, what people are up to right now. And then this story finishes by sort of figuring out where the to be continued lies, more or less. What previous study was done that, yes, answered its own question, but also brought up another question that your study is going to answer. Because that's kind of the way literature's realms of research work and move, is that a paper will propose a problem and it will answer the question, try its best to solve the problem by the end of that paper. Then another paper will take the same problem up. They'll either look at it differently or they'll ask the next question along a similar line, and they'll get hopefully closer to this major overarching solution to the problem. That's how a literature is built. And so, in any study we try to do, it's pretty likely that somebody has done work reasonably close to it, probably because it's the work that inspired us to go and do the work that we're doing, to tell the story we're telling. So you can follow up on something quite directly, or you could be addressing a really similar idea that somebody else already has. Maybe you saw a problem in another study, so you conducted one to try to fix it. That's sort of the wrapping up and big finish of the story part of an introduction type paragraph or a lit review in a psych paper, because you'll finish by explaining the exact foundations for your hypothesis. So they might be due to the fact that you're following up a previous paper, or you might need to, again, back out a little bit and describe the fact that, okay, so I'm asking this brand new applied question in a new area of psychology. Let's say it's distracted driving, and I need to dive back into the basic research on task switching in order to come to a reasonable hypothesis with regard to this specific question in a distracted driving paradigm. No one's done it in distracted driving, so I have nothing to refer to there, so I'm going to go back to the basic work. And so that's where you might end up looking for more basic foundations for your hypothesis, especially if you have an applied hypothesis. Of course, you might be doing basic work, and in that case, foundations will be fairly clear. So with those steps, it's important that you do the background research before you move too far into them, because there will be lots to do. There is a good 100 years of work in psychology, almost 150 now. There will be lots of papers you'll read but don't include, and that's okay. That's part of this process. Because one of the bigger challenges is making sure that the idea you have, particularly when you're new at this, isn't an idea that someone else has already had and already done. So you want to really work hard at that background research to ensure that you're not trying to do something that's already been done and thus wasting your time, essentially. So once you have the background research and you've worked your way through each of those steps, you're going to want to piece them together as paragraphs. You could potentially have more or less all 6 of those steps on the previous slide as their own paragraphs, although the foundational knowledge and the current state of the literature will probably be several paragraphs in most cases. You could also separate it into this general frame in which you start by stating the problem, describing the background, talking about what's missing in that literature, and then describing your study and how it fits. That would be a really short sort of 4-paragraph version or 4-section version of an intro, or in some cases a whole lit review. And remember, we're still using evidence to back up claims, but we're doing it maybe at more of a macro level now. You'll do it on the micro level within all your writing. But if you say the literature is missing something, you should be sure about that. So you could maybe have a source that says so. But if you want to know with no doubt that you've scoured PsycInfo and that no one else has asked the question that you're trying to ask. And again, if you're following up directly from somebody else's study, cite them right away and say, this is where I'm following from. Then you'll want to edit, of course. Writing is an iterative process. You will slowly hone your lit review or your intro section / lit review over many iterations. Edit it, look at it again, edit it, put it away for a week, edit it again, have somebody else edit it yourself again. It's a long, arduous process to get to good writing. And then at the end, what sadly usually happens is you've got a great piece of writing that's usually long. And when you end up submitting something for publication, usually you have to cut and you have to figure out how exactly to make your point convincingly and a little more succinctly. So in the previous video, we worked up toward the arguments on the slide here. We were talking about cross-race misidentifications specifically and how they can be attributed to the more basic other race effect, originally shown in, or maybe originally meta-analyzed, I believe, in 1989. So we were making the point that the most of the research is done comparing African American faces to Caucasian faces with Caucasian participants, but there's also effects when you show Caucasian individuals Asian faces, Mexican American faces, and First Nations faces. And remember, this is probably not a perfect paragraph. It doesn't have a good, strong conclusion statement. But I wanted to show you a little more about this paper. This is the table of contents for the intro section, the lit review of that paper. So you see that it starts with the other race effect, goes to other race effect in memory, other race effect in perception, individual differences, and then the current research. So you can look at this, even though it's just 5 topics, one of which is not helpful at all, current research, you can probably come to a reasonably good assumption about what this paper was about, what project they maybe have done. You could, especially if you know about the other race effect, you could start generating possible hypotheses for them, possible research questions. But even without knowing, you can certainly look at all this and say, okay, we're going to look at the other race effect, potentially individual differences in the other race effect. And they might be in memory and they might be in perception. And in fact, it does look something like this. I'm showing you the current research section here. So this person was trying to explore the extent to which the other race effect hinders participants' accuracy in a face recognition task that is similar to a lineup in order to, over the long term, develop an instrument that measures individual differences in the size of somebody's other race effect. So how much worse are you at identifying faces of a different race than identifying faces of your own race? So they talk more about it here. Feel free to pause and read through. But you can see the specifics of the method and the hypotheses here and how they're nicely laid out and really specifically and precisely outlined. Now, as you learn to build this kind of lit review story, one way to train yourself in how those look is to start to learn to recognize the pieces of a story when you're reading. And so I have some pointers on that. The first one is to start out by trying to get a picture for how the entire story is going to go. Read the headings of a paper before you dig into any individual section. Then maybe skim the topic sentence for each section. Try to figure out what the author's overarching goal is. What do they want you to know by the end of the reading? What is their thesis? Might be another way to say that. See if you can grab their thesis from the first paragraph or two, and then see if you can identify how each section will contribute toward that thesis, will provide evidence for that claim. Usually the point is to convince you that the study they've done was necessary, that it was interesting, and that it will inform their discipline and hopefully the world at large, the wider real world beyond just the laboratory. Those background sections might have multiple parts, as I've already said. Try to identify each part of a background. They might not always have subtitles. so that you can figure out what your relevant takeaway will be from each section. Your relevant takeaway might not be the same as mine, might not be what the authors intended it to be, and that can be okay, but usually having an idea of what the authors meant for you to take away is helpful in telling you what they wanted you to know overall. And so my advice is to think back on that main goal, that thesis of the entire paper as you start each new section, and think about how you anticipate this section will contribute toward that claim, how it will provide evidence for that claim. And then when you finish the section, think again, did this provide the evidence I thought it would? If not, how did it differ? Did it still actually do what it set out to do? This is all work in contextualization. If you can continually contextualize as you read, you'll have a more informed and definitely slower, but probably more efficient reading experience. We talk all the time in Psych about how sometimes you have to read a paper a few times to get anything out of it. And that's definitely true. True for me now, as it's true for you now. The years in between us of studying this stuff don't make reading all that much easier. They do make it somewhat easier, but still sometimes takes us several trips through papers to figure out what on earth is going on. But this effort toward continuously contextualizing is the thing that enables professors and grad students and upper-level psych students to read a little bit more efficiently. So try to build those skills intentionally and early. Most papers will, again, go through that same basic set of steps that I've outlined. They'll state their goal or their claim. They'll describe the background research and identify its missing pieces, and then they'll describe how their study or how they recommend some study should be done in order to fill in that one last missing piece. Not all papers will do this. They won't all do it in this nice order, and the reason for that is that sometimes it doesn't quite make sense to write it like this. Every paper is unique and different, but it's also the case that sometimes papers aren't well written enough to make these pieces identifiable, and that can also contribute to needing to read the thing multiple times before you understand the author's intentions. And I don't mean to attack writers, psychologists. I don't mean to suggest that we are bad writers. We're certainly not. There's lots of great writing in psychology, but it's important to remember that every individual researcher's goal isn't always to communicate their points very clearly, and it's also not always to communicate their points to non-experts. And as an early year psych undergrad student, you are still a non-expert. You're working your way toward expertise, but these papers aren't exactly written for you just yet. And so that's part of the reason it can be so challenging to work your way through them. But this course and this process is the thing that will get you to that place of expertise. And you will, and you can. I believe in you. So once you've worked your way through recognizing the story, the intention of the authors, try to think about what's missing. And this is the way that you can both more deeply understand what's written and start to develop your own research questions. So as you read, write down questions you have. And then when you're done reading, see if you can answer those questions. If you can, great. You read well, they wrote well. Everything works out. If you can't, then maybe you missed it and it would be useful to go back through the paper to double check. Or maybe you've discovered a research question. Maybe you've come up with an idea that is related to the paper you're reading, but is different enough that you could propose to go and do it yourself. You might want to go and do some searching to make sure nobody else has, but that's how ideas are generated. Another thing to think about is that you very likely have a different perspective than the author. You're a different person, for one thing, and you might differ from the author in a number of ways, unless you're like a really similar researcher and a really similar type of person doing the same kind of research. You're probably quite different. So, do you have any knowledge or ideas that you could bring to bear that might inform this research that the author hasn't considered? Have you experienced something in your life that isn't really addressed in the paper? Sometimes the author will make the answers to these questions easy for you by outlining the next steps themselves. But if they don't, think about what next steps you would take if you were this author. What study would you do right after this one? What's the next question to answer? Then think about the application back to the real world. How does this work apply back to the real world? Can you answer that? The author should help you answer that, if not answer it for you. And if you can't figure out how it applies back, then you're definitely dealing with a very particular kind of writing that is going to be a little tougher to interpret. And you'll be dealing with the parenthetical question here: how well does that work apply back to the real world? If they don't tell you how, you might want to think about whether it even does apply back to the real world. Important questions to ask. And then as you get more experience, the kind of last phase of this is starting to get really technical with identifying next steps and identifying questions you have as you read. So you can do something like notice that there is a set of variables that could come to bear in a situation, and the authors test variables A and B, but you wonder about variable C. A very reasonable way to design follow-up studies is to identify a third variable that the author either didn't test or didn't think about. Or maybe the authors rule out one or two confounds, but they don't manage to rule out a third that occurs to you. Either they couldn't or didn't think of it. So this is essentially just a more technical way to say, what are the next steps? What questions do you have as you read? Same basic idea. So it could be the case that you identify some of these naturally before you think about them technically. So with these suggestions together, you can both create stories out of your lit reviews, give the reader a thread to follow through your writing, guide them down a path, tell them a story that has a clear thesis, beginning, middle, and end. And you can also start to work to identify those things as you're reading. Because again, the skills of reading and writing are really, really closely linked. And one of the better ways to become a better writer is to read more frequently. So if you want to be a better psychology writer, read more psychology. If you want to become a better fiction writer, you should read more fiction, and so on and so on. And so that is the real purest essence of what I'm trying to say here. And so I hope this video is helpful for you as you build your skills. See you in the next one.